Well, folks, we're back again, and we're going to try to finish up a little bit about the function of the nervous system so then we can get on in future videos in regards to the structure, in regards to looking at the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, the other lower brain centers, the spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. And those will be coming up in some subsequent videos that we have prepared for you. We want to finish up and tie up everything we wanted to talk about in regards to the function of the nervous system. We previously talked about the fact that when we look at the nervous system, it's divided into two main sections. One's called the somatic nervous system, which is primarily more of a voluntary type of a thing, or very conscious. We understand, we perceive these things, not just purposeful movements of muscles, but also when we talk about being able to sense certain things, or certain feels, or touches, or heat, or sharp, or burning, and stuff like that. So the somatic nervous system is involved with the conscious portion of the nervous system. And again, it's divided into a motor portion and a sensory portion. The motor, we know, has efferent fibers leaving from the brain going out, and the sensory, we know, we have afferent fibers picking up sensations in my external environment and bringing it back into my central nervous system to be able to process. The other branch of the nervous system is what we call the autonomic nervous system. And we mentioned autonomic sounds a lot like automatic, which is pretty much what it is, because it's pretty much involuntary. It happens because it's been programmed to happen that way. In other words, I don't change my heart rate, I don't change the rate of the contractions of my intestine, which is called peristalsis, and things like that. These things, I can't change the size of my blood vessels voluntarily. These are all involuntary processes in an effort to try to maintain that homeostatic control. So we're going to divide, we're going to talk about a little bit of the difference between somatic versus autonomic nervous system and how they actually function a little bit differently in a number of different categories in the coming up slides. So let's first talk about a little bit more about the somatic nervous system. On the efferent side, we're talking about how we get that output from the brain to be able to stimulate skeletal muscle. Okay, and we'll talk more about that location. There's an area in the frontal cortex that actually is a specific band of tissue that actually comes up from down the side towards the temporal lobe and then goes down the middle of the brain, which is basically where all my motor activity originates from. So we get an output for skeletal muscle control from the brain to stimulate the skeletal muscle to be able to contract. And then we talked a lot before about how in my skin I have various sensory organs, as well as special senses such as rods and cones in the eyes, taste buds, hearing receptors in the ears and stuff like that. And these are picking up stimuli from the external environment to be able to take to my brain to be able to process. When we think about the autonomic nervous system, though, again, we're talking about more internal structures. We're talking about the innervation of the viscera. We think if we took a piece of intestine and threw it on a table, you say, oh, look, that's a piece of intestine to me. But on the other hand, we know that inside the intestine there are blood vessels, there's connective tissue, there's all kinds of specialized tissue, as well as nerves that actually will allow the viscera to be able to function. We also know that in blood vessels, blood vessels we know carry blood, but they have to be under control of something. In the smaller blood vessels, the arterioles, when the blood leaves the heart, it leaves by larger vessels which are called arteries, and the arteries have an elastic wall. But as they get closer to their destination, they lose that elastic wall, and the wall becomes more muscular, and that muscular wall allows that artery or that arteriole to either to be open up a little bit or close down, depending upon where I want blood to go. So this is under the control of the autonomic nervous system, and we know that autonomic nervous system works very well with both the hormonal as well as it does have some cross interaction with the somatic nervous system, all for the basic purpose to be able to obtain and to achieve homeostasis, which is what the body really craves, like all the time, like we've mentioned. I think this is probably about the 956th time this semester, so we've done that. Now, sensory input. When we think about sensory input, autonomic versus somatic nervous system, again, in the somatic nervous system, we've talked so much about the special senses, as well as somatic senses, touch, tingle, burn, and all those things that we mentioned before. Those are the somatic senses, the special senses, the rods and cones in the eyes, the hearing organs in the ears, the taste buds and stuff like that. However, in the autonomic nervous system, we talked before that a lot of the receptors are what we called and we've named before as those interoreceptors. And these are either chemo or mechanoreceptors for the most part. Chemoreceptors identifying some abnormality in the chemical structure or the chemical environment in that area at that particular period of time. And the involves like stretch of a wall. If you eat something, what happens to the wall? The intestine will stretch, which in the stretching of the wall will actually cause a contraction, which causes that material to be moved down the pipe. So like squeezing or like milking a cow, that type of a thing. So a lot of the receptors that we get in the autonomic nervous system are either chemoreceptors identifying the chemical environment of that area internally, or mechanical receptors, things such as stretch and so forth. Again, these autonomic nervous system sensory fibers are in the viscera and in blood vessels, so they're detecting stretch, they're detecting chemical changes, and there are some from special senses and somatic senses interaction with those as well. But this is where we talk about the different sensory input that we get. Again, sensory input mostly from the somatic, very much external receptors from the outside, where we get a lot of the autonomic is almost all interoceptors from inside the body, which are mostly chemical or mechanical receptors. When we talk about motor control, the somatic nervous system involves primarily that motor control, that voluntary motor control of muscle. Okay, and this comes from the higher center. When I mention higher center, I'm talking about the cerebral cortex, the outer portion of the brain, and my motor control does come from that outer portion of the brain. It's a very voluntary area. There are some contributions from deeper centers. We talked about ganglia. Deeper in the middle of the brain are these basal ganglia. On the back of the brain, there's a big lump back in the back. It's called the cerebellum, the brainstem and spinal cord, and these are important in regards to motor control. The reason why, and I'm going to mention this very briefly right now, is when the signal comes down to a certain area, and we'll talk about how that's laid out in the cerebral cortex. When that signal to move a muscle starts in a certain area in my motor cortex, it's very gross. It's not very well coordinated. It's very abrupt, okay? And if that is left unchecked, when the time it gets down to the muscle, the motions are very uncoordinated. As that nerve tract comes down from that motor cortex and crosses over to the other side, it passes through areas such as the basal ganglia and gets input from small little interneurons from the cerebellum that actually help to modulate or to help to control it. Okay, it sort of like modifies it so that now this motor impulse is much more controlled, so that by the time it gets down to the skeletal muscle, it's much more fine. Some people have certain types of neurological disorders where they lose this basal ganglia control on the cerebellum, and you'll see things like tremors. Like in Parkinson's, we'll get to see a tremor, like it's called a resting tremor, which is sort of like this. We'll also see people who have what's called ataxia. And ataxia is if I ask someone if I point at my picture on the screen, I'm pointing and the fingers are going all over until they finally find the area where there it is. Okay, that's up there. And they have very uncontrolled, jerky type motion simply because while the stimulus does come from that higher cerebral cortex, it's very gross, very abrupt, very non-refined. And finally, when it goes to the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and to some extent the brainstem and spinal cord, it becomes modulated or more controlled. In the autonomic nervous system, basically, it's just because it's involuntary, comes from the deeper centers, in the brain, not so much from the cerebral cortex, but the deeper centers. Things such as the limbic system, which is around the temporal lobe, behind the ear, deep to the ear. The hypothalamus, which is very deep, which is on the bottom of the brain. The brainstem and spinal cord as well, which are what are called lower centers. Higher centers, cerebral cortex, lower centers, things that are deeper than that. There's a minimal input from the cerebral cortex. There is some cross coordination, but minimal impulse from the cerebral cortex. So that's what the motor control, the differences between the somatic nervous system versus the autonomic nervous system might be. When we talk about the motor neuron pathway in regards to somatic versus autonomic, in the somatic nervous system, it's basically called one neuron pathway. We have a somatic neuron that goes from the central nervous system and snaps directly on the effector. Again, what will happen is we'll have a neuron that goes from that motor cortex. It goes down somewhere within the brain, crosses over, it becomes modulated, will meet in the spinal cord another neuron, an interneuron, and from that point on, it heads out as another neuron that actually will go to the effector. So once the motor nerve leaves the central nervous system, it's only one nerve. It's one shot, one line. It's sort of like that nonstop flight. You're going there. You're not going to go through Atlanta and Houston and St. Louis to get to Los Angeles. It's from Cleveland to Los Angeles. It's one flight once we leave the central nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, it's basically a two-neuron pathway. We have what's called a preganglionic neuron that comes from the central nervous system to these preganglionic neurons in what's called the autonomic ganglion. And the root ganglion, the dorsal root ganglion neuron from the also in the back. So what happens is we're going to find an area where we'll have cell bodies which are actually outside the central nervous system. And these cell bodies outside the central nervous system will then have another neuron that leaves from there to go somewhere. So we actually have part of the nerve coming from the central nervous system that leaves the central nervous system that meets in a ganglion somewhere. And a ganglion is where cell bodies are. These cell bodies will meet with other neurons that will head to another area. So basically there's multiple neurons, a two neuron pathway with a one neuron pathway with the somatic nervous system. Okay, and that's what we see. There are also some neurons from the central nervous system, the cells of the adrenal medulla, but that's a little bit different, so we'll talk about that later. Neurotransmitters. We talked about acetylcholine a lot as a neurotransmitter when we talked about muscle, and that's the primary neurotransmitter that we find in the somatic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, again, the preganglionic axons release acetylcholine. The post-ganglionic axons release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Okay, so norepinephrine is also another neurotransmitter. Now, these aren't the only two. There are lots of other neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's in serotonin centers inside the brain. So that feel-good neurotransmitter, it stimulates serotonin receptors in the brain that make you feel good. Dopamine. Dopamine also is something that was in people with Parkinson's disease. The dopamine that's made in a certain nucleus in the brain doesn't make the dopamine, and when it does, it causes abnormal, sort of like a poverty of motion as well as some tremors. And so those are some other types of neurotransmitters that we see. But in the somatic nervous system, acetylcholine, autonomic nervous system, the two major ones are still going to be acetylcholine and norepinephrine, but there's lots of other neurotransmitters that we'll probably mention in passing as the next one goes by. Effectors. The effectors that we see that cause an effect in the somatic nervous system is basically the skeletal muscle. We're talking about something that we control, voluntary, somatic nervous system. And what do we control? We control our skeletal muscle. In the autonomic nervous system, it's largely a smooth muscle of the viscera as cardiac muscle and glands. So basically what we're talking about is the things that we have no control over, such as smooth muscle, which is either lining my organs, smooth muscle that we see in the lungs that open and close some of the airways, the smaller airways called bronchioles, smooth muscles that are in the walls of the arterioles, the smaller vessels, and these are affected by the autonomic nervous system, as well as the cardiac muscle is under control. We talked about how that vagus nerve, which has largely parasympathetic fibers, the 10th cranial nerve from the brain, goes down to the heart that will actually slow the heart, okay, because it's mostly parasympathetic. Parasympathetic we know is part of the autonomic nervous system. And the glands, endocrine glands. The endocrine glands secrete their hormones. Why? Because they're stimulated by a nerve, an autonomic nerve, that actually will cause that endocrine gland to produce and release the hormones that are needed to create another effect as well. So basically that's the difference in what we see the somatic versus autonomic in regards to the effectors, or the things that will actually cause an effect. Okay, responses. In the somatic nervous system, again, because it's involving skeletal muscle, it's skeletal muscle contraction is what happens with the somatic nervous system. In the autonomic nervous system, because again those nerves are supplying viscera, because they're supplying blood vessels, because they're supplying airways, because they're supplying heart, what happens causes contraction or relaxation of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle supplies the viscera, okay, and it supplies the muscles in the smaller arterioles that will open and close, the smaller bronchioles, the smaller airways that will open and close with air going to the alveoli or the little air sacs. We also have the autonomic nervous system involved with increased or decreased rate or force or contraction of the cardiac muscle. I just mentioned that a couple minutes ago with the vagus, sort of slowing it down. Also the heart will increase with things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is because of autonomic nervous system of the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland secretes the epinephrine that makes the heart go faster, also makes the blood pressure go up and things like that. We also find with the autonomic nervous system there's increased or decreased secretion from glandular structures. Again, the glands, the endocrine glands, are under autonomic nervous system control. They get a signal from the autonomic nervous system. Why? Because again, the brain is interpreting the stimuli and sends out either somatic, which goes to the muscles and stuff like that, or the autonomic signals that go out, and those autonomic signals then go to the endocrine glands that will actually cause those endocrine glands to secrete and release the hormones that circulate throughout the body, and by doing that causes an effector response down the road. Okay. Subdivisions, again, with the somatic nervous system, we're talking about the motor division as well as the sensory, which we've pretty much bled dry so far in regards to what I talked about. And again, in the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight, as well as the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more rest and relaxation. Okay. Again, the exception to this is the GI tract, which I'll mention in a couple seconds in regards to sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system. But that's how it's divided. So the somatic nervous system, motor and sensory, afferent, taking a signal from the outside, going to the brain, interpreted, sends out a motor signal going out from that. So the motor output is efferent. And the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, usually speeds things up, make things go faster, increases metabolism, things like that, versus parasympathetic, which usually in most cases on a basis starts to slow things down, again with the exception of the gastrointestinal tract, which is the opposite to that. A lot of things receive dual input, okay, in regards to the autonomic nervous system. They get input from both the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, okay, and one stimulates, and usually that's going to be the sympathetic, and one usually inhibits or decreases, and that's usually the parasympathetic, and again the exception is the gastrointestinal tract. If I stimulate the heart sympathetically, the heart goes faster. If I stimulate the arteriolar muscles, the blood vessels will constrict and the blood pressure goes up. If I stimulate the heart with the parasympathetic fibers, such as in the vagus nerve, it slows down. Now, if I go to the GI tract, which is the exception, the parasympathetic nervous system makes things go. So the parasympathetic nervous system basically controls the GI tract, how it digests, how things move through the GI tract, and the sympathetic nervous system stops it or slows it down. Okay, so that's the opposite. So that's one of the areas where it's flip-flopped in the GI tract. That's why, you know, when you were a kid and you went to a picnic and there was a lake and you wanted to go swimming, and mom and dad said, hey, you can't swim for an hour after you eat. Okay, well, what happens, the idea was, if I'm swimming, because of the activity, it stimulates my sympathetic nervous system. On the other hand, if I eating and digestion is under the control of the parasympathetic. Now I have the sympathetic working against the parasympathetic. One wants to slow, one wants to speed up, and as a result they don't work. Guess what? You're probably not going to drown, okay? But on the other hand, that was the old philosophy behind that. That's why that was, you know, you can't do both. You got to wait for an hour, you know, where that hour is that magic number. Who knows? So what we've talked a little about here today is the difference between the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. What I think is really important to recognize is the somatic nervous system are things that we could feel, that we could do, that we have control over by using our brains. And again, in higher animals, because our brains are much more, in the higher levels, the higher centers are much more advanced, we have a lot more control over a lot of that stuff. Where what happens is when we look at lower animals, frogs and toads and all kinds of stuff like that, basically their lower neural systems, lower centers are much more prominent, and most of the things they do are very autonomic or automatic. Okay, so the somatic nervous system, we have some control over it. We get the feeling and stuff like that. Autonomic, we don't really have a whole lot of control over. Basically, the body senses this and is already pre-programmed to be able to come up with some type of an effector response. And hopefully this gives you a little bit of idea in these last three general nervous system type lectures in regards to function, a little bit about the basics, and this is just the basics. This is just touching the tip of the iceberg about how the nervous system works. What we're going to be talking about in the next couple presentations, the next couple videos, is individual parts. We'll talk a little bit more in the next presentation about the cerebral cortex. What does the cerebral cortex do? Then we're going to talk about some deeper brain centers in another video. Then we're going to talk about the cerebellum. Then we'll talk about the spinal cord, and then we'll talk about peripheral nerves and how that works. So we got a lot more coming up, but hopefully you've been watching the videos. Hopefully you're enjoying it. And hopefully when you watch them, you can write down some questions. So when we do video conference and teleconference during our class times, as we're going to try next week, we're going to see how that works. Hopefully you'll have some questions you could ask, and hopefully I'll be able to answer those things. Hope you're enjoying these so far. Again, they're a little rough, but I'm a little rough too in regards to my presentation style. So anyway, hopefully if you have any other questions too when you watch these, please watch them, look at them, and if you have any questions, please let me know, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.